Ani Bojo, Wabazikwe Nindejnakas, Wabajijin Dodam, Wasaksin and Tonjaba, Toronto and Dow, and Anishinaabe Minoa Jaganash. I'm Maria Hupfield. I'm a transdisciplinary performance artist. And what that means is I just make lots of things. I'm a maker, I use my hands. And then I activate my creations in live performance. And as a transdisciplinary artist, I'm really working across a lot of different mediums, a lot of different disciplines, having a lot of conversations, often in collaboration with others. And we together work to create something that is whole and new and of itself, that doesn't necessarily connect individually to each stylo, but rather gets rid of those in this way that opens up spaces for new imaginings and new possibilities. I feel like there's a debt of gratitude that exists for feminists. I'm definitely someone who, went to school in the 90s and saw myself as a feminist. And the more I learned about what all of that entailed, I really connected with it. And I think Regan de Logans is someone who does a really good job of talking about that as well, about that debt and how that helped academically to position yourself as or myself as a woman and an artist as I was pursuing art studies. I think one of the things about feminisms is that when we think about it, it's actually, perhaps now we could think of it more as being about the patriarch, right? Like it's a response to the patriarch. It's a response to the society that we live in. And because of that hierarchy of power that exists, and that's something that Lee Maracle talks about, this hierarchy of power that places, white men at the top, white women, and then kind of goes down. And at the bottom is Native men, and then barely human is Native women. And as we know today, that hierarchy of power is further complicated by white supremacy. So when we add that layer into it, that layer, which is something we think about when we're thinking about, everyone who's non-white passing, although you don't have to be white to be a white supremacist, as we know. And then for Indigenous folks, that the other implication, of course, is we're never talking about colonization. So when you add that layer to it as well, right, that's where we start to see things like binaries that get exposed. We start to see the implications of gender that reduce how we're seen and what way we're seen. And I think those are parts that are missing from those conversations and have always kind of been missing from that conversation. So whether or not we're thinking of the different waves of feminisms and the way that they were, we had in that hierarchy, the white women who were basically jockeying for a position to be at the table, right, of that hierarchy, so moving it and leaving the rest behind has always kind of been the criticism that I've always felt and thought about. And then now with Native feminism, so as a student, I remember coming across this book, Recognition of Being by Kim Anderson, who's amazing. There's a cover picture by Bev Kosky, one of my good friends, with all her aunties, or whether we're looking at like Joyce Green and her amazing book, Making Space for Indigenous Feminisms, or we're looking at Indigenous women and feminisms, activism and culture. Like there's just so much today that exists around the academic study of Native feminisms. But what's always kind of been an issue for me as an artist and a formerly trained artist is that we never see this connection being made between all of this, like all of that, even more, and what's happening in the studio or what's happening by artists. And that really is because the arts is so dominated still by men, right? Because of that patriarchy, because of that white supremacy. And yeah, I think within my own practice, I'm really fortunate. I lived in Brooklyn for 9 years. And at that time, there was a lot of artisanal stuff happening. And so what that allowed me to do is I could sew, I'm, working with felt, industrial gray felt, and I'm sewing objects. And suddenly this hierarchy of power that accompanied that in the art world, which is a hierarchy of materials, was eliminated. So this history of reducing the work of women, of Indigenous women who are the primary makers in a lot of communities, that didn't matter anymore. It wasn't like I had to make a painting to prove I was an artist. Where at a different point in time, someone like John Quick to See Smith was being radical by making a painting coming out of the Southwest. Like people just didn't do that. So her content, her approach, it was all very radical. But for me to be able to work with this industrial felt, to make all kinds of, stuff, to mash things up, was speaking to this continuity of way of making and practice immateriality that doesn't start at the point of contact or even look at, Greek and Roman, because I'm someone who's I took the art and art history program. I'm well aware of Greek and Roman art, but always looking at, well, what's happening here on the land we're at? What about this other history? And suddenly that the door opens and we can begin to look at that stuff. And I don't mean in a modernist kind of way that sterilizes it and strips it of its context, but rather looks at it holistically with everything that goes with it, the songs, the stories, the dance, and we can begin to free art from being tied to one way and open it up to exist on, so many possibilities for movement, sound, action, all of that. In my own work, I'm always coming back to this idea of sound. So, Leanne Simpson writes about Jim Dumont, who's an elder, an Anishinaabe elder who I know. And Jim Dumont talks about truth being this word, Weiwei, which is about sound, and listening to your heart and listening to who you are, and following that. So if we start to think about listening to that, paying attention, then that can really change how we're operating in the world. And so that's something that I'm always in my own practice as a transdisciplinary performance artist, coming back to this idea of sound and listening in the body, and what do we hear when the body moves, what, even listening to other people. I've often collaborated with other musicians as well, like Electric Gin, did a project with Laura Ortman, or poets, or whoever they might be, and that's adding this other dimension for me as someone who's an artist and a maker, to suddenly see this object become animated and with new life and new possibilities. And over time that narrative builds up and that object becomes loaded with all kinds of imaginings. With Double Punch, this is a work that has a whole life behind, a whole life and dimension around it that exists outside of it being shown. So when it's shown, it's very static. And that's something I'm returning back to. So it's, originally these were these gloves that I wore in a performance. I was collaborating with Charlene Vickers. They have a cute little turtle on them, and we had this whole outfit that we wore, and we each wore one on one hand. So it's, strong, like strength on one hand, defending ourselves, power. And then on the other hand, this elegant red evening glove with fringe. So we're kind of balancing out and moving through spaces. The nice thing about fringe is that it allows you to think about your movement. And with the glove, Double Punch with the jingles on it, then there's also the sound component. So it's, really tying all of that together. But Double Punch, one of the first things about it is to realize they're not boxing gloves. So it really comes from something like Taekwondo. So the idea of a double punch isn't something that's meant to leave you exposed, but rather it's about knowing how to operate in a system. It's about or having to navigate systems of power and still get points, still be able to show, still be able to do and perform. I come to my practice through sports. So I'm not like a trained dancer or, a musician, although I love all of those things. I really am someone who, played a lot of sports. And so I'm very physical with my movements. And so it's natural that I would get attracted to something that's about like having a movement that's about a strong core, right? having that strength. It's not so long ago that artists, just by their race, were denied participating in that. So I feel it's really navigating that we should be included. Absolutely. Why? Where's Jean Quick-to-See Smith's solo at the Whitney? I'm so ready for that. Like I'm just ready for these moments that I'm always constantly thinking, why hasn't that happened already? And also with my own work, I also curate. So a lot of those projects I'm curating are intended to target those omissions and are really about creating conversations that are just, I don't see happening, that I'd love to be, part of or see out in the world and kind of plant a seed in that way. So yeah, I'm really navigating a lot of these institutional spaces. And these are spaces that my husband, Jason, and I talk about often. We collaborate together as Native Art Department International, and we talk about these spaces. And I've heard him say that, they're just such toxic spaces. They're not meant for us. People don't, like they don't work in the same way. So it's constantly having to find ways to negotiate them, find ways to come in through the back door, get involved with a project. So a lot of the work that I do with space, now at this point in my career, has to do with relationship building. So it's about trust building. It's about partnerships. I like working with contemporary curators. They're so used to working with artists from all different backgrounds. And so one of the things I loved about living in New York as an artist was that, I'm there bringing whatever I want to the table. And everyone else, I'm there with everyone else. No, we're no different. And we get to present ourselves in however we want. Although I did see at the time that New York definitely was behind in terms of being on the East Coast and thinking about conversations around, or even including, or how to navigate, or how to think about Indigenous or Native content, coming from Canada, which is where I am right now. That they're definitely so blind to things. I remember being part of a project on whiteness that Claudia Rankins was running, and taking a moment and being like, no, this isn't about whiteness. This is about anti-Blackness, because there's no space in here for any conversation that includes, Native people. There's an omission with that for sure on the very land that we're on. And we're seeing that change more and more. I don't think you can talk about Native feminisms without talking about land, without talking about sovereignty, community, kinship, relations, all of that. And those are things that just aren't present in feminism. Those are things that institutions are not thinking about. That's I've seen and participated in panels where they're talking about feminisms. I remember, as recently as last week, and it's just not there. They're not. So there's a lot of work to be done. There's a project I did with the Museum of Art and Design in New York, with Jean Quick-to-See Smith and the Feminist Art Project out of Rutgers. And it was a day of Indigenous feminisms. And one of the things we wanted to do was, of course, we sent out personal invitations to people to apply, because, invitations, knowing your community is so important. It goes a long way to pay that respect. And then we also did an open call, just because we wanted to canvas and see what was out there and give everyone the chance to come forth. And one of the things I found right away was everyone just wanted a show. just wanted to like have an opportunity to share their work. And so I feel like at that time, a lot of seeds were planted, and the country is so big. We may know of each other, but we don't necessarily get the opportunity to have conversations together, to be in the same space. So I think a lot of the work around that day was just about doing some of that work, growing a garden and getting that planted and hoping that people, with each project I do, whether it's my own work or a curatorial project, I feel like it's a seed that's being planted and it's setting a spark. And hopefully it's not meant to be the be all and end all, but that other people will see that, connect with it, and it will grow. One of the things that's missing because of the way white supremacy operates is that there is no citation. So when you're working in these spaces, anyone can be an expert. Anyone can read a book and say suddenly, oh, I'm Native or I'm mixed, and they can start to put some beads on a guitar or something, and they're like, okay, now this is Native art, because the actual substance is no one's really paying attention to anything beneath the surface. So as long as it's affirming someone's ideas of what Native identity is. So there's a lot of people want the art, but not institutions want the art, but they don't actually want the people. They don't actually want those, the real juice of things. So we're missing a lot of the good stuff, unfortunately, in a lot of projects that are out there. And so there is a need for having, Indigenous-led projects. There's a need for respecting and listening to the artists, those conversations where they're like, actually, this is and really having to position things like the context of what you're saying, that this is actually what I'm saying. It's not what you think I'm saying. This is what and why, right? So there's still a lot of work that obviously needs to happen, and that's something that can't happen on its own or in isolation, that it's always happening together. So as I navigate multiple spaces, I'm always kind of, to think of it as speaking multiple languages, and every project, every success I do is opens the door, and I'm always, it's not just me coming through the door. I'm like bringing all these people with me. I'm like making referrals. I'm, following references. I'm, doing all that work. I'm recommending people, and just trying to amass a lot of content and reference material so people can come back to, have something that they can go to and come back to. But I do think relationship building is so important that when I was living in New York, it was very often that I would encounter someone where I was the only Native person they had ever met. And so that's a lot of responsibility to carry, but also realizing that hopefully I won't, maybe I'll be the last, maybe I won't. So I don't know what I want to say with that, just that we need to just being aware of how that visibility just hasn't been present, and what that means, what those implications are for Native women, and how detached that is from the reality of being on the ground, at the same time that someone in Thunder Bay, that Barbara Kentler is having like a trailer hitch thrown at her stomach and then she dies. Like, that's a very real thing that happens to someone who is cared about and loved. And to think about, children going into, social services, or the way that, the real physical implications that happen in our community. It's not, so I feel a lot of responsibility in my own artwork, that if I can be visible, if I can do this, and become part of the social consciousness, become valued, then it can point to so much. I believe that art has the power to do so much good work as well. At the same time, not falling into those trappings of that exist in the art world as well, right? Like, so that I don't become, in being part of a system that feels toxic, that I don't become toxic myself, right? How do I maintain my own balance? How do I maintain my own sense of self? And, not lose myself. And so I think that there's that work that's happening as well at the same time. I think as a performance artist, how I'm balancing myself and how I'm connecting and staying real, and that those values are still part of and embodied throughout everything. If I could have one takeaway with my art practice, this always comes back for me to I always think of Charlene Vickers, when we worked together, and how we went down to Santa Fe. We made all these really wacky things. The gloves were there, all kinds of stuff, just really outrageous. And we packed in this red bag and we carried it down. And it was during the Santa Fe market. And the thing is, like, I'm not from the Southwest, I'm from the Woodlands. I know nothing about this, but we're going there with our sunglasses and carrying our bags, and everyone's looking at us like, oh, you're artists, right? You must be artists. And we're like, yeah, we are. We're artists. We're here. We're going to do a performance. You should come. And they're so unprepared for us being in that space, doing, coming out with all these crazy things. We had a table, we laid them out. And then we were just demoing them. And we found that as we were performing, people were actually backing away from us. They were just not engaging. And we're like, what's going on? So then the next time we did it, because we did it twice, and the next time we said, okay, this time we're going to make signs. So we made these signs that said, we wrote them out, it said, free demos. So it's like, we're not trying, we realized, oh, they think we're trying to sell them stuff. Right? This is a performance. So it's like the audience's relationship. This wasn't New York. People were not like, in New York, people would be like, oh, performance artists, what are they up to? But this was Santa Fe, and they're thinking, we're just there to sell them our craft items. So they're looking at them for like these, masterful like ribbon awards. And we're like, dude, these are some boxing gloves. This is, these are some mashups. And so what I loved about Charlie was she said, I just love that we're out there doing stuff and people are like, we're just doing crazy, outrageous stuff. And people are like, what's going on? And I feel like that I'm so often in that space where I don't know that how often I felt or feel understood in the world, right? Like, I think I do things and they're like, what? This is industrial feather. What? These are bells. What's going on? And I'm like, yeah, that's what art's about. That's the reality of it. We're, putting stuff out there, and I want people to think, and I don't want them to be expecting it. I don't want to be this predictable, like, there, of course, some of the stuff I make, I'm an artist. I want to look good. I want to have this, have certain aesthetics, but also because that makes me feel a certain way. And I'm hoping if it makes me feel that way, it'll make other people will connect to that too. So I'm really looking ultimately at connecting and that humanity. And I think that is also about performance art. It really is about a human to human experience. So yeah, if people taking a double take, if they look again and it's not what they're expecting, I'm like, of course it's not, because nothing is what you're expecting. Like anything someone's thinking about Native women, I can tell you they're wrong, right? Like we're looking at really strong folks who are doing all kinds of labor and work and love and care and heart and warmth and knowledge and goodness and can cook the shit out of anything, like it's just all this that you can't contain that. And if I can point to it, we see some of that in more historical pieces where we're just like, wow, like that is something that's beyond a masterpiece. Like that cradle board, that beaded cradle board, that's beyond, like, I don't even think people understand today what's going on in some of this work, the cosmologies. And that's the loss, like that really is the loss of the reality of what we face today, because it's not, looked into. It's not considered. Yeah.